So we're going to look at how Germany leads Europe on a path towards World War II and how the war breaks out, how it kind of evolves over the course of itself, and then how it comes to a conclusion. Of course, during that time, we will look at some Nazi ideology as well as racial motivations for the Holocaust that occurs during World War II. So here we go. World War II begins, first shots are fired in 1939, but you could really trace its origins back to 1933, when Germany withdraws from the League of Nations. And the League of Nations, of course, was an international organization that was designed to ensure peace and to bring stability to the world. Now, it was not really an effective organization necessarily, but the symbolic moment where Germany leaves the League of Nations kind of indicates what Hitler's long-term goals are, and that is to create disorder, chaos, and of course, war. And that starts in 33. And he then has kind of a few steps that eventually will culminate in war. All the while, Western countries are following a path of what's known as appeasement, where they let him do this. So the first act then is in 1935, when Hitler reinitiates the draft in Germany. And this ignores the Treaty of Versailles, which limited the size of the German army. Hitler shows total disregard for that by creating and building and strengthening his army. There's kind of a blind eye turned towards Hitler and these motives by the Western powers, and that is the term that we call appeasement. And we typically assign that to the British. The British term, or the British follow this path of appeasement, where they grant Hitler whatever he wants. And then one way they show this is by in 1935, there's an Anglo-German naval agreement signed. And what that does is it allows the Germans to build a navy, but it sets a ratio for the size of the German Navy in relation to the size of the British Navy. So that way the British Navy is never really threatened by the German Navy, but it allows some militarization and puts in place the manners for which Germany can further build their navy and strengthen it up. So there's that. And then, in 1936, Germany sent their army back into what had previously been demilitarized, that region known as the Rhineland. And this sends shockwaves throughout Europe, especially in France, and France freaks out, but they don't want to be drawn into another war, so they drop back. And Britain and the rest of the European powers don't do anything. And so this kind of gives Hitler essentially the permission he needs to continue breaking the rules. And the reasons why, it's pretty complicated. I mean, and you can understand why Britain is not really interested in confronting Germany. And the three major reasons are that first, the British were more afraid of communism than they were of Nazism. They really thought that the Soviet Union was going to be their big opponent, and it turns out that they would be. But first they had to deal with Hitler. There's also a general feeling of guilt towards the Treaty of Versailles for British people. You remember John Keynes, the famous economist. He was anti the Treaty of Versailles, and so were a number of other British people. And so those feelings of guilt kind of made the British say, you know, it's okay that they break that treaty. It was unfair anyways. And then on top of that, of course, is an unwillingness to engage in another war after the horror that was the First World War. So the British just don't want to be dragged in to another one of those wars. And understandably so. So that's in Germany. Italy is also expanding at this time, and this will lead to confrontation. And so this is off the back of Mussolini declaring the needs for colonies for Italy. They had a few colonies along the east coast of Africa, but nothing significant. And they really wanted Ethiopia, in large part because they had been defeated by an old Ethiopian king named Menelik II when they had first tried to colonize in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And they were kind of embarrassed by that. That always kind of stuck with them as an embarrassment. And so they wanted Ethiopia. So they launched an attack against Ethiopia in 1935, and the League of Nations immediately condemns the attack, saying you can't do that. Western powers also condemn it, saying you shouldn't be imperializing, we've moved beyond that, national self-determination, so on and so forth. The support that Mussolini gets is from Adolf Hitler. who is okay with this Italian expansion. And it is because of this that there is an agreement made between Germany and Italy, and then eventually Japan, that creates the Axis powers, right? And this was a turning point because Mussolini didn't like Hitler, and Hitler didn't like Mussolini. On personal levels, they couldn't stand each other. Possibly because they were both megalomaniacs and kind of saw each other as competition, but they didn't like each other. But because Hitler was willing to support the Italians, Mussolini was willing to look the other way for some other issues he had with Hitler. Another coming together for them is support for General Francisco Franco in the Spanish Civil War. And both Germany and Italy support Franco in this fight against the communists and provide him with military support as well. And this is also a good chance for the Germans to test out their new technology now that they had completely disregarded the Treaty of Versailles. And so they used what's known as the Luftwaffe, that is their air force, in some significant bombings in this Spanish Civil War, and it's where really some major atrocities take place. So this cements the alliance between Italy and Germany. And then Germany looks to expand. So Italy had already looked to expand, and now it's the Germans' turn to expand. And in March 1938, Hitler basically turns to his neighbor of Austria and says, look, you are going to appoint Nazis to positions of power. If you don't, we will invade you, and we will conquer you. And Austria was not nearly as well armed or ready in a position to defend themselves, so they kind of give in and cower to Hitler's threats, and they appoint Nazis. And the very next day, literally the very next day after this, Hitler moved his army into Austria to occupy it and establish Austria as kind of a client state in a greater Germany. And this is accepted by the Western powers because they view this as national self-determination and nationalism. The Austrians were German too, so it's okay that they were ruled by Germany because they were Germans. And Hitler has them vote on whether or not they want to be annexed into Germany. And overwhelmingly, the people of Austria vote yes, that they want to be part of Germany. So there's kind of legal and moral justification for this as far as the Allies are concerned. Hitler's realizing that there's no one who's going to stand in his way and stop him, so he demands that Czechoslovakia cede the Sudetenland to him. There's a region of Czechoslovakia known as the Sudetenland, which had a number of Germans living in it. They were not a majority, but there was a number of ethnic Germans living there. And so Hitler said, look, you've got to give us the Sudetenland because those Germans need to be ruled by Germany. And Czechoslovakia was in no place to defend itself, although it had France as an ally. Britain and France meet with Czechoslovakia and Germany. They run through a series of meetings, and eventually they agree that Czechoslovakia will give up the Sudetenland. And this was, again, justified because there were Germans living there, and it prevents war. So Britain comes out of this all happy because they believe they've created peace for their time, and that nothing's going to happen, everything's good. And meanwhile, Hitler, this really reaffirms and confirms for him his belief that the Western democracies are weak, they have no backbone, and that they will not stand up to anything that he does. And so this then grants Hitler basically free rein to do whatever he wants. So about 1 year later, in March of 1939, he occupies the rest of Czechoslovakia. Just marches his army in and says, you're a client state, you're all part of Greater Germany now, get over it. And the Western powers protest, but there's basically nothing they can do at this point because they've given in so much to Hitler. He then surprises everybody by signing something known as the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, which is a 10-year agreement made between Hitler and Stalin that they would never attack each other for 10 years at least. And everyone's really taken aback by this because the sworn enemies of Nazi Germany were communists, and the sworn enemy of the communists were fascists, and yet somehow they had reached an agreement. What was not known at the time was that it was a partitioning of Poland, that the Germans would get the western half and the Soviets would get the eastern half, and then they would agree not to fight, but they would get Poland and it would be good for everybody. So this secret agreement really kind of stuns the West and really rings the alarm bells. And then the war actually begins. On September 1st of 1939, Germany invades Poland. and they use a strategy known as the Blitzkrieg. This invasion forces Britain and France to meet their treaty obligations and enter the war. Of course, because Germany and Soviets had already agreed to split up Poland, it takes a matter of 4 weeks using the Blitzkrieg technique for Poland to be completely overrun. And the Blitzkrieg, it translates to mean lightning war, and it relies heavily on mechanized units, tanks, planes, and troop carriers, basically, to strike quickly and decisively through the enemy army and then kind of leave the mopping up to the infantry. So there's this idea that there'd be quick aerial bombardment followed by tank units moving through and just shatter the lines, create chaos, and keep pressing and let your infantry come through and mop up everything later. And it works incredibly effectively. Within 4 weeks, Poland is defeated, and not only does the western half of Poland go to Germany, but the eastern half, as well as Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, go to the Soviets. Germany then quickly turns north and west and occupies Denmark, Norway, and Holland, the Netherlands. And then they look further west to Belgium and France. And they follow very closely the Schlieffen plan that they had before, and they attack using Blitzkrieg very quickly. And they end up trapping part of the British Army, known as the British Expeditionary Force, on the coast of Belgium, and they have to be evacuated at Dunkirk. And it's this massive effort using all the British fishing boats, every available boat to ferry these British soldiers across the channel to save the British Army to fight another day. Because it's very apparent that France is going to fall. And in fact it does. By July 1940, France has fallen to Germany. And Germany has created a new puppet French government known as the Vichy government. This is a puppet government led by Marshal Pétain, and it collaborates with the Nazis, and it really is not popular amongst the French, but they feel like they have no other choice because they were so soundly and quickly defeated by the German army. So, by 1940, almost the entirety of Europe is conquered by Germany. And that leaves Britain standing alone. And it's known as, the term that's used is called Fortress Britain, because they're on their island, they've kind of fortified, and they recognize that they have to hunker down to hold off the Germans. And they're led in part by Winston Churchill, their prime minister, who is, he's known as the Bulldog. He is tough, he is stern, and he is not willing to quit. And he really rallies the people of England behind him in order to maintain resolve when it looks like all hope is almost lost. And so it is at this point that Germany begins one of the more famous battles of the war, known as the Battle of Britain. It is an aerial battle that pits the German Air Force versus the British Air Force, and it lasts for months. It begins in June and doesn't end until October. Up to 1,000 German planes are attacking Britain every day. There's, at the end of this, Germany's able to field about 2,400 planes, and Britain's able to field about 1,900. By the end of it, over 1,400 by the end of it, Britain only has about 400 planes left. Germany only has about 500. So this is a super devastating and long battle. But by the end of it, it turns out that Germany is not able to break down Britain's defenses. And so Germany finds themselves unable to invade Britain. In part because of this aerial battle, but also because the British Navy still holds the seas. And so the German plan was to be able to knock out the British aerial defenses so they could then use their Air Force to hunt down the British Navy, but they're unable to do so. So Germany is never able to launch an invasion of Britain. Because of this, Hitler turns his attention elsewhere. And he turns it to the Soviet Union. And so he ignores the non-aggression pact he signed with Stalin. And in June of 1941, Hitler attacked the Soviet Union, launching with a surprise attack using blitzkrieg tactics again, and rapidly pushes back the Soviet army. So that by October of that year, Leningrad was surrounded. The Soviets were besieged in Leningrad, and they were on the verge of being besieged in Moscow. The German army had pushed all the way up to these major cities. Unfortunately, they were then hit, or fortunately, I guess, They were then hit by the brutal Russian winter, which had previously decimated Napoleon's army, and it almost completely wipes out the German army, because the German army had launched this attack in the summer. They had their summer equipment with them, and they were unable to bring their winter supplies up, and so trying to survive in the freezing Russian winter is very difficult. It also makes it difficult to continue maintaining your military operations because it's too cold to fight. It is at this point that the United States enters the war in the Grand Alliance because of an attack on Pearl Harbor by Japan on December 7th, 1941. And so the U.S. enters the war on the side of the Soviets and the British. And kind of three major points are made at the beginning that allows this alliance to work and allows these three countries to work in tandem to help win the war. And first is that they decide on a policy known as Europe First. And that is that the United States and Britain would work to defeat Hitler and Germany first before turning their attention to Japan. So the United States would be fighting this two-front war, but Britain would be focused on defeating Hitler, and the United States would send most of its soldiers that direction to defeat Hitler. Secondly, they kind of set aside any political differences that there may be to focus on the military, and that's the most important part. And that makes sense because, again, Britain and the United States felt like the communists of the Soviet Union would be their biggest threat in the future, and so they have to set aside those political differences in order to come together and militarily defeat the Nazis. And the last thing is that they agreed to force the Axis powers into what is known as unconditional surrender. So that means that they would not accept separate pieces. So Germany couldn't sign a separate peace with Russia, as they had done during World War I, and they could not sign a separate peace with Britain to kind of split up the Allied powers. So after these agreements are made and the United States enters the war, you see these countries go into total mobilization. All parts of society are mobilized to fight this war. It is total war again on an even more massive scale. And it turns out that the United States over the course of the war gives over $50 billion in aid and weapons to its allies in Britain and the Soviet Union. And so all kind of, it's not just those two countries that are working together to fight against, and use total war. The Soviets do as well. And there's these really incredible moments where the Soviets literally pack up entire factories, put them on trains, shift them across the country to Siberia where they're not in danger of being overrun by the Germans, set them back up, and continue producing tanks, guns, bullets, everything that the Soviet Red Army needs to continue to fight. And it really is a testament to the willpower of the Russian people that they're able to hold off this onslaught, move these factories, go and commit to this work. At the same time, once the United States enters the war, there's a significant uptick in resistance movements across the country. Generally, these are led by communists because of this international communist movement. The Soviets encourage these, but also they are kind of helped out by Allied airdrops of weapons and supplies. So all of this leads to the tide of war changing, and the Nazis begin to lose these battles. And this really begins, it begins when the United States enters the war, but on the Eastern Front, it begins after the Battle of Stalingrad. And this battle is a long, drawn-out battle from July to November of 1942. And it really even draws into kind of December and January of the next year. And the Soviets are able to turn back the Germans in this kind of house-by-house fighting at Stalingrad. They're able to push them back and out of the city and then quickly overrun not just the German army, but the Italian and Romanian troops who are stationed outside of Stalingrad, and begins this massive push by the Red Army to roll up the overextended Nazi lines. By the end of January of 1943, the German army in the Eastern Front was almost non-existent, in large part because of the devastating winter, and also because Hitler refused to let these troops surrender, so a number of them had to fight to their death or simply deserted. So you kind of got a few things going on there. At the same time, there is success in North Africa, which is another front to the war, where the Axis armies are defeated at the Battle of El Alamein, which is a huge battle in just outside of Alexandria, Egypt, where the United States and British forces are able to turn back the Germans and the Italians And after this, they're able to run them out of North Africa and turn those former French colonies into support for this war effort. This then creates a staging ground where the Allied armies could invade Sicily. They could just hop quickly across the Mediterranean through Sicily and into mainland Italy, which they do in 43. And in 43, as soon as the Allies land in Italy, the Italians rise up against Mussolini, who they don't like, against a war that is not popular, and depose him. Now, they have him arrested. Mussolini is saved by the Nazis, and they set up kind of a secondary government in northern Italy. By the end of the war, he's captured along with his mistress. They're both executed. Then they're taken to a public square where they are harassed, have stuff thrown at them, and their dead bodies are kind of beaten after they've already been executed by firing squad. So there's a lot of frustration. And the Italians at this point switch sides and begin to fight with the Allies. All of this culminates in the largest invasion in history, which is known as D-Day. On June 6, 1944, the Allied army lands at Normandy in northern France and begins their move towards Germany. And so begins the race to Berlin, which is a race between the United States and the Soviets to see who can capture Berlin first, because there's real key to capturing the capital of the enemy army. Also underlying this is an effort to grab all the Nazi scientists to use for the upcoming Cold War. Now, neither country really knows the Cold War is coming, but there's animosity between these nations that will not be resolved after the war. Germans begin to surrender, and on May 7th, Hitler commits suicide. On May 8th, the remaining German forces surrender. This is known as VE, Victory in Europe Day, effectively ending the war in Europe. A few months later, the United States drops an atomic bomb on Hiroshima and then Nagasaki, ending the war in the Pacific. So that's kind of how the war plays out. Underlying all of this is the kind of horrific actions of Nazi Germany. And this is because of the racial ideology that the Nazis have. And in this ideology, there's kind of three different tiers to the races, at least the European races. And on top are the Germans as the master race. And they're joined by the Nordic peoples, such as the Danes and the Dutch and the Norwegians. And because those people are related to the Germans or look similar to them, they are considered this higher race, and they are acceptable. They can live kind of without any damage. Below the German master race were the Latin peoples, and like the French and really the Italians as well. And these people are considered kind of second class and second rate. And so they're tolerated because they help the war effort, but they're also forced to pay a special tax because they're not as good in the Nazi viewpoint. Below them are the Slavs, which include the Russians, the Balkan region, and all the Eastern Europeans. These people are considered subhuman. They were to eventually all be enslaved and kind of killed out forcibly through forced labor and sometimes just execution. And land taken from them would eventually be given to German peasants. And this ideology is seen in the treatment of the Soviet prisoners of war. 4 out of every 5 Soviets who are taken prisoner are killed because the Nazis simply believe that these people should be enslaved to help the master race. And so their treatment of Poles and Soviets is just absolutely horrible. And this new order, as it was called, was really helped along by the SS led by Heinrich Himmler in propagating and spreading these propagandistic ideas. And then, of course, there is the Holocaust. Below even that new order of ranking existed the Jews and the Gypsies. And the Nazis believed that they should all be immediately exterminated. And that's the goal, kind of from the get-go. So German Jews are deported from Germany to concentration camps in Poland and other Eastern European countries. The killing camps are, for the most part, located in Eastern Europe and away from Germany, kind of in part because most of the Jewish people that are killed are living in that region, so they don't want to spend money to make them travel far, but also because they want to turn over the grunt work of that evilness to non-Germans. The SS develops special killing squads whose goal is to round up and execute Jews that are found. They do this especially in the Soviet Union, but also in Poland. This was termed the final solution to the Jewish question. And the final solution was to exterminate them all, because again, remember that Hitler viewed history as a constant battle between races, with the Jews playing the evil race all along. So they're rounded up, sent to either concentration camps or extermination camps, where they're forced to work to exhaustion, they're fed little, they're treated as non-human, they're berated, they're beaten, they're separated from their families, and eventually they're sent to their deaths. By the end of the war, more than 6 million Jewish people had been killed, and the toll of World War II is massive. Beyond just these 6 million, you end up with a total of about 40 to 50 million people killed as a result of the war.